Welcome to today's episode of The Square, a curious conversation with Jill Elliott. I am joined by Emily Strain, who's the Director of Workplace Strategy. And of course, Miss Elliott, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, guys. I'm very excited for this conversation.
So you are an artist, you are the founder of The Color Kind, but you have like a ton of different hats. You have been a creative strategist, you're an entrepreneur. I'm just curious, so much of what you've done is in the creative space. Why do you do what you do? What do you find fulfilling about being in this space?
Have always been like equal parts loving the art, the color and design that goes into a design process, to any kind of product, to art, to fashion, to film. But I'm also like a huge nerd when it comes to the business side of things and looking at numbers. And so the intersection of those two is what I really love. I love learning about process and operations, whether that's in a studio practice or in a business, and figuring out how you can move levers within a process to tweak what your design outcome is, or tweak what your approach to design is and drive a business result. So I'm like super passionate about the intersection of those two spaces.
Jill, I loved what you said there about the intersection between business and creativity. Do you ever find those things to be in conflict with each other? Like as a creative professional, sometimes, you run into deadlines and financials. How do you navigate that?
I think there is a natural friction that exists between those two, but the beauty is really in figuring out how they can work together. When I managed a big team, when I met you at Fossil, I used to have this conversation a lot with designers who were frustrated with a deadline or a design brief, or saying like, I just want to be freely creative. And that's an art practice. That's what artists get to do. We all, as a designer, try to have a hobby maybe that fills that need for us. But when we're in a business that needs to drive volume and hit deadlines, we don't always get that luxury. So the friction is natural, but I actually enjoy the friction. Like, I think sometimes even in my hobby art practice now, I find that I need to set some constraints. Like I can only work in 3 colors, or I can only work on something of a certain size. Because if I sit down, I try to make something every day. If I sit down without any rules, I almost get overwhelmed in the process. So I think that sometimes those two can work together to create something really beautiful.
Yeah, it's like the parameters, right, of the business, or the
boundaries.
size, the boundaries
Yeah.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah,
So tell me a little bit about The Color Kind and what you guys do on a daily basis.
sure. So The Color Kind, I founded a few years ago when I was like in a big life transition. I had just left Fossil, where I had been the chief creative officer for multiple years. I had spent most of my career there, over 20 years. And what I really loved about that role was the process of interacting with creatives day in and day out. And I found that when I myself would sit down to create, I was finding this like joy and calm and stress relief from it, that similar to what I eventually found in meditation, but at that time in my life, it wasn't available to me in a meditation practice. And going back to that, like me being equal parts research nerd and creative, I started to research, like, is there something to having a creative practice that does benefit you mentally, physically, spiritually? And it does. There was at the time like medical journal research. It wasn't super accessible. But today it's something that's a well-covered aspect of especially healing. It does all kinds of things to stave off aging in our brains. It helps us problem solve and think more innovatively. It lowers cortisol, reduces stress and anxiety, and boosts our joy. And when I would talk to friends about like, come over and paint, they were like, I'm not creative like you. I don't know how to do it. And so The Color Kind was born of a way to be an on-ramp and an encourager to help people pursue their own creative practice as a hobby. I did that at the beginning through workshops and teaching and writing. And today I do it mainly through writing. And then I've transitioned into becoming more of an artist and designing some products that will help people experience that in their home and find their own creative practice. So that's really what I was excited to share, was that creativity it's not for the beautiful piece that you create. It's also for the process and the beauty that can come within you just from doing the process.
So the journey,
The
so
journey.
much, not so much the destination.
Yeah. I love that
Yeah.
too, Jill. I mean, this has been a really stressful year for a lot of people with COVID. Do you find that having a creative outlet, a creative practice can really help reduce stress and anxiety?
For sure. You can, I did a workshop actually with a lot of interior designers and had them just do like 5 minutes of sketching and have people open with breath work and then check in with themselves at the end. And you can see people physically settle into their bodies in a different way. Emily, I know your sons too. I think it's so visible in children, especially if my daughter comes home from school and has had a stressful day. She's not always super interested in creating because that's what mom does and she doesn't want to be forced into it. But if it's something special and she feels invited to use my tools, I can see her just release a lot of the stress or the worry or the anger out onto the paper, and she walks away from it just a little bit freer and different. So it's so interesting if you do start your own creative practice to kind of check in with yourself when you sit down. How am I feeling? Like, what's one word that I'm feeling right now? And then once you've done 5, 10, 15 minutes, it doesn't take a long time. How do you feel at the end of it? Some days you might still be frustrated because it just doesn't always go smoothly, but you will find your flow and kind of settle in and find the things in it that make it fun for you and keep bringing you back to your creative practice.
I gotta say, especially when you have kids, trying to create on a daily schedule, that's a pretty tall order. Are there some kind of key things that, and maybe in terms of setting up a space or having a box that you go to, or is there some key elements to making that a daily habit?
For sure. As with any habit, I think it's most easy if you attach it to something that's already a habit that you're doing every day. So for me, at the beginning of this journey, which was about 6 years ago that I started creating most days. I don't do it daily, but most days. I did it every morning with my coffee before anybody else in my house was up. So I set a little space on my kitchen counter with my art supplies. So they were always visible. I did it with my coffee. So it was a consistent time of day. My supplies were visible, which was like a great inviting reminder to get back to the work. I set a timer, just 10, 15 minutes. And I worked on really small pieces of paper at the beginning, 5x7 little watercolor cards, which just kept it approachable. The time wasn't huge. And then I also had, I've always been a collector of images. You can see on my wall behind me, I've always had some sort of pinboard at my office and at my home studio. And so if I was stuck that day and I didn't know where to start, I would just copy something. And, in a creative practice, I think there's no shame in copying. It's not like we're trying to profit off this work or sell, but sometimes it just takes a jumping off point to get you started. So those are the things that I always encourage people to do is attach it to another habit, consistent time, short amounts of time, have your supplies visible, keep a bank of inspiration, and then just try to do it most days and just keep going.
Don't get bogged down if you miss one day.
Yeah. I liked that you acknowledged, Jill, that there can be kind of like an intimidation to this. Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned, starting small, like with a 5x7 and creating that consistency. How would you, what would be your advice to somebody about kind of getting over the fear of getting started? Because I know for me, even as a creative myself, sometimes I can be a little intimidated by that.
Fear in the artistic process is something I'm not sure you ever get over. Like I've done this most days and I'm still a little fearful of the process. And when I read the practices of other artists, even like there's a great exhibit at the DMA right now, John Gree, that just is like one of the only retrospectives that's been about his life. But when you read about him, he burned like all of his notes, all of his practice work, anything that he didn't feel was up to what he wanted his image to be, he destroyed. And I think that comes from a place of fear and control. So even professional artists that spend their life in pursuit of art deal with fear on a daily basis because it is scary. There's no path here. There's no right or wrong way to make art. But if you focus on just showing up every day and the positive emotions that do come out of it. Like for me, I love color and shape and mixing color combinations together in a unique way. So I may hate the piece that I create. Most days I actually hate what I create, but there's something in it that makes me happy. Maybe a color combination that I want to explore for something later, or I did something accidentally with my brush that seems really interesting and I want to try to do something with that later. So I think just acknowledging that fear is a healthy part of any creative process, and then deciding to just get on with it anyway is the best way to do that.
Okay, so Jill, we've been talking a lot about creating for yourself and the benefits that can bring to your mental health and well-being. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about creating for someone else, creating for a client or for the human experience. What advice would you have, or how do you approach like building consent and getting others to kind of buy your creativity and the direction that you want to go?
I love this question. This is what my whole professional career has been in, is building consent and buy-in around design, whether it was when I was in-house at Fossil or today, like as an outside design consultant. I think it really starts with understanding the problem that you're trying to solve first, because design in a corporate setting at the end of the day is really about solving a problem, whether that's a business need, or what your next campaign is going to look like, or what a space is going to look like. There's so many problems that you have to solve. So getting really clear on what that problem is and building consensus around the problem is the first step I always take, because if people think we're solving something different, if everybody in the room thinks we're solving some different problem, we're not going to come up with a solution that works for everybody.
Yes.
So building consensus around the problem, and then showing like rough steps throughout, inviting people. I love a vision board. I love showing rough ideas and swipe and tears and color swatches, no matter what the project is for, a product or an ad campaign or a space, because people respond. Like problem solving is usually a lot of words, and you can get pretty close, but visually is where you really start to see like, okay, this person has a visceral reaction, good or bad, to a certain color or a shape. So I'm gonna lean in or go way away from that. Also, the process of having it as a vision board that's loose and rough, I think lets everybody feel like they're a part of the process. People want to be creative, even if that's not their day-to-day role in a corporate environment. But getting to be in that creative process helps them come along on the journey. And then, next presentation where it's more formal and we started to tie some things down and make some decisions, just to keep confirming all the way. And then I try to go away, much easier as a consultant than it was when I was in-house, but I like to bring the client on, 80% of the journey, and then go away and really get heads down and figure out again, like what the process looks like that's going to bring this to fruition better than even what we were talking about throughout the design process. How is it going to come to life even more magically than it did on a mood board? So, and then showing them at the end and just talking about, I think hindsight feedback is a really important part of the process too, because I'm sure you guys know this. As soon as you finish a project, there's something that's wrong with it that we didn't know at the time, or that we don't want to do again. And I love to close that process right after, whether it's a photo shoot for a client or a space or whatever it is. I love to close the loop pretty quickly after, so that you hear the feedback and then it's just in your mind the next time that you work on a similar type exercise or experience.
What about when you hit roadblocks? I mean, because it's to your point about the journey, those journeys always have, potholes and roadblocks that you kind of have to navigate through. How have you found, or what ways have you found that are successful to kind of navigate those?
A lot of times I will kind of take a pause in the process. I found if we try to work through a roadblock, creatives are like, thankfully, we are very emotional beings, and so if we are met with a roadblock,
for better or for worse,
for better or for worse, what you get. So if we are met with a roadblock that we weren't anticipating, sometimes I'm like, okay, let's take a break and maybe take a day, and just kind of go away, and then come back with like, okay, let's go back to the problem. We heard this. This is what we're trying to solve. Are we still all aligned on that? Okay, yes, no. We all agreed to, this part of the vision board. What's changed since the last time we met, or what are you not liking in what we've shown you so far? And the thing that's, I think, so challenging and so exciting about design and the creative process is that it could be as simple as the language that somebody's presenting the work in, or their demeanor, or, I've been in design presentations where my designer or myself, we might be like, here it is, it's perfect, it's done. There's nothing, more inviting to pick something apart than somebody presenting their work like it's perfect and can't be touched. So much of successful creative design in the corporate world is about communication and the interpersonal skills to read body language and to know your audience. We got to where, we'd prep people like, okay, we're presenting to the finance team today. What they want to know first is that we hit margin and that we're not going to be paying these like crazy shipping fees. Start with that because they don't actually care what the product looks like as much. But start with the things that your audience needs to know. And those are the things I think having that marketing and business background really led me to approach design in a different way. Like tell the people what they want. And then most of the time they'll let us go make our cool stuff and kind of leave us alone. But if we don't answer their needs first, it's a mess, Yeah.
Well, I totally agree with that, Jill. And I want to ask you, when you're talking to your team internally or when you're managing creatives, what are some good tips with how to manage creatives? Because I know they can be a little bit of a challenge.
I don't know what you're talking about.
to keep them on track and to keep them managed. So how do you find balance in letting them create and keeping people on task and collaborating in that way?
I always try to, as methodical as a process as I just defined, where we, go through these steps. I also want the design team to explore things that weren't on the vision board, that nobody else ever saw the light of day, because I think a lot of times what's captured on a brief and a vision board is going to get you pretty close. But it also is going to get you somewhere pretty expected. And so making sure that my team had enough free time to design. Like, for example, if we had a line plan and we needed to design 20 new products for a season, I would always fight with the merchandising team to keep 5 of those open. Like we'll give you 15 that have to drive 80% of the volume, but the other 5, let us bring new ideas to the table. Don't tell us it needs to be this, because that's not very creative. And a lot of times out of those open design SKUs would come something that was the start of the next big trend.
So I'm a really big advocate for hitting the business needs and making sure our designers know that, we're in business to hit our numbers and to drive business, but we're also here to explore and have some creative time. And that's super important to me, whether it's in art direction, in art, setting aside time to just try new practices that I don't really know how they're going to work out is just as important as working in a medium that I'm super comfortable with.
I'm curious, Jill, what's next for you? Like, what's coming up next with the Color Kind? Where are you? Give us a little insight as to where you're headed.
Sure. So I'm working on a wallpaper launch right now. I did a home remodel last summer, and I kept looking at I wanted something really fun and colorful for a powder back here at our house, but I also like order and trying to find something that's like happy and colorful, but also organized. I could not find anything. So I ended up taking one of my paintings and printing my own wallpaper.
Oh, cool.
And had a bunch of people like, where can I buy that wallpaper? I'm like, I guess I can make some wallpaper. So I have a line coming out with a friend in New York of some more nature-based watercolor painted wallpaper. And then I'm going to have just a small collection of my own just to test this one pattern. And I'm starting to explore getting back into product design as well, what that means for the Color Kind. What are some products that are functional but also pretty for your home? So I have one that I'm working on right now. I have no idea about how long that'll take to launch because it's a completely new category for me. And then I still do some workshops, some teachings, and consulting. So, but I'm just excited to explore, I think for a while, the Color Kind was all about inviting others into their own creative practice. And I love that. And I still cover that from a writing standpoint, but I'm excited to also imagine how the Color Kind can bring some of those moments of color and joy and calm into your own studio or home, and just come to life in a different way.
Okay, Jill, so finish this thought for me. Creativity is
essential. I think creativity is something that people falsely believe you're born with or you're not. And actually, everybody is creative. You just need to invite it in. And it's a great way to get in touch a little bit more with your purpose and to express yourself uniquely in the world. And the world sure needs that right now.
Oh, I can think
perfect.
of no better place to leave it. Jill, thank you so much for joining us. Emily, thank you for being here.
Yeah.
And thank you for listening or watching. If you are watching this on the YouTube channel, then you're not getting the full conversation. You're getting maybe half of it. So make sure you check out the audio podcast in the description link below so you can hear the full conversation. Thank you again, Jill, for joining us. Emily, that was wonderful. It's always fun to have you co-hosting.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching or listening. Make sure you check out the next episode of The Square.